God's chosen ones, born in toxicity, destined for glory. What if the pain you've experienced, the struggles you've faced, and the toxic environment you were born into were not accidents? What if I told you that your difficult circumstances, those challenges that seem unfair and unchangeable, are actually part of a divine plan? A plan that you may not yet understand but is guiding you towards something greater. You see, the Bible reveals a pattern, one that's been repeated across generations. God often chooses His most faithful servants from the most broken places. He often picks His chosen ones from families steeped in dysfunction, pain, and toxicity. I know it's hard to see it this way when you're in the middle of the struggle. When you're living in the middle of chaos and you feel like you don't belong, it's easy to think that your family situation is a curse or a punishment. But the Bible shows us that some of the greatest people God used, those who shaped the course of history, came from families that were anything but perfect. In fact, their journeys often began in environments filled with betrayal, rejection, and hardship. Take Joseph, for example. Betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, and then falsely accused, Joseph's life seemed destined for tragedy. But God had a plan for him that would save nations. Or think of Moses, who was born into oppression and raised in a broken family structure, only to become the great leader who would deliver God's people from slavery. Even David, the shepherd boy rejected by his own family, was chosen to be king. So why does God allow this? Why are His chosen ones often born into toxic families? The answer isn't simple, but it's rooted in something profound. God uses pain to shape His people. He uses the struggles of life, especially the ones we face in our families, to mold us into who He needs us to be. The Bible teaches us that trials and suffering can refine us, develop our faith, and prepare us for the greater purpose He has for our lives. I know that it's not easy to accept that your circumstances might have a greater purpose, especially when they seem overwhelming. But remember, God doesn't waste anything. Every painful experience, every moment of rejection, every toxic relationship is part of the process of transformation. Just like He did with Joseph, Moses, David, and so many others, God is working in your life, even when it feels like you're stuck in the middle of a storm. He's preparing you for something greater. In this video, we're going to explore why God chooses to bring His chosen ones into such difficult family situations and how, through the lens of the Bible, we can understand that the pain we face today may be shaping us for a greater purpose tomorrow. So, if you feel like you're stuck or trapped in a toxic family, know that God sees you, He knows your pain, and He is using it to prepare you for something bigger than you can imagine. Keep watching, because the story of your life is far from over, and your greatest moments might still be ahead of you. Part 1: The Chosen Ones in the Bible. Throughout the Bible, we come across people who were chosen by God to fulfill His divine purposes. These individuals were not perfect, and their lives were not without struggle. In fact, many of them came from the most difficult circumstances. Yet, they were selected by God because He saw something in them that others may not have seen. These chosen ones weren't picked because of their family backgrounds, wealth, or power. Instead, God chose them for His purposes, and He used their lives to shape the world. When we talk about the chosen ones, we need to understand that being chosen by God doesn't mean a life of ease or protection from hardship. In fact, it often means the opposite. Being chosen means being set apart for something greater than yourself, something that may require you to go through difficult experiences in order to become who God needs you to be. Take Joseph, for example. His story is one of the clearest examples of God's sovereignty in choosing someone who would experience intense family dysfunction. Joseph was the beloved son of Jacob, but his father's favoritism created deep jealousy and hatred in the hearts of his brothers. They sold him into slavery, faked his death, and abandoned him. Joseph's life took an incredibly painful turn, yet God used those very circumstances to mold him into the man who would ultimately save his family and many nations during a time of famine, Genesis 37-50. What appeared to be betrayal and suffering was part of God's plan to elevate Joseph to a position of influence in Egypt, where he could ultimately fulfill his divine calling. Then, there's Moses, who was born into slavery and raised in a broken family. He was separated from his birth family as an infant and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, growing up in a palace that was far removed from his true heritage. Even though he was raised as royalty, Moses could not escape his identity as a Hebrew, and when he saw an Egyptian mistreating one of his own people, he acted out of anger and fled into exile. It was in this exile, in the wilderness, that God called Moses to return to Egypt to lead the Israelites out of slavery, Exodus 2. Moses' life is a reminder that God does not choose based on our ideal circumstances but based on his purpose for us, even when we are far from where we think we should be. David's story is another powerful example. As a young shepherd boy, David was overlooked by his own father when the prophet Samuel came to choose the next king of Israel. His brothers, more physically impressive, were considered first. But God saw what was in David's heart and chose him, despite his humble beginnings and the dysfunction in his family. David's rise from the fields to the throne was not without its challenges. He faced rejection, betrayal, and warfare. Yet, God's purpose prevailed, and David became a man after God's own heart, 1 Samuel 16. These examples show us that God doesn't choose his servants based on their family backgrounds or their current situation. Instead, he looks at the heart and calls those he has chosen for his purposes. And the chosen ones often face difficult circumstances, especially within their families, because it is through those struggles that they are shaped, refined, and prepared for the greater tasks God has for them. Part 2: The Role of Family Dysfunction and Toxicity in Shaping the Chosen One. When we look at the stories of the chosen ones in the Bible, one thing becomes abundantly clear: family dysfunction and toxicity are not obstacles for God's plan, they are often integral to it. God doesn't work in spite of family dysfunction, he works through it. The Bible is filled with examples of families torn apart by jealousy, favoritism, lies, and betrayal. Yet, in the midst of this dysfunction, God's purposes unfold. Consider the story of Jacob and his 12 sons. Jacob, who was later renamed Israel, had a complicated relationship with his own family. He favored his son Joseph above all others, and this favoritism sowed the seeds of deep resentment and jealousy among his other sons. This toxic family dynamic ultimately led to Joseph being sold into slavery, Genesis 37. While this story is heartbreaking, it's also a reminder that God can work through the brokenness. The very family that rejected Joseph became the family he would eventually save. In the case of Abraham and Isaac, we see another example of dysfunction within the family. Abraham, the father of the faith, had a son, Isaac, who was deeply affected by his father's choices. Abraham's decision to have a child with Hagar, instead of trusting God's promise with Sarah, caused strife within the family, especially between Isaac and Ishmael. The tensions between these brothers had far-reaching consequences, but through all the discord, God's plan to bless the nations through Abraham's descendants remained unchanged, Genesis 16:17. David's family was another example of dysfunction. While David himself was a man after God's heart, his family life was far from perfect. His sons, especially Absalom, rebelled against him, leading to a period of chaos and division within the kingdom. David's relationship with his children was fraught with betrayal, anger, and heartbreak. But through the pain, David learned valuable lessons about God's justice, mercy, and forgiveness, lessons that he would later share through his psalms and his leadership. God uses the dysfunction in these families to shape his chosen ones. Toxic environments become places where his strength is made perfect in weakness, 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9. In the case of Joseph, God's hand was upon him even in the midst of betrayal. In Moses' life, the very brokenness of his past prepared him for the incredible leadership role he would later assume. And David's struggles with his family brought him to a place of deep dependence on God, which was essential for his reign as king. The message is clear: family dysfunction, toxic dynamics, and broken relationships are not the end of the story. In fact, they often serve as the backdrop for God's most significant work. These challenges are the crucibles where God refines his chosen ones, teaching them humility, forgiveness, patience, and resilience. Through these struggles, they grow in ways that would not be possible without the challenges they face at home. As we reflect on these biblical stories, it's important to remember that God is not limited by our family situations. He doesn't need us to come from perfect homes or ideal circumstances. Instead, he uses our struggles to prepare us for a greater purpose, just as he did with Joseph, Moses, David, and so many others. Your family dynamics, however broken they may seem, are part of God's plan to shape you into the person he has called you to be. Trust in his sovereignty, knowing that he can bring good from even the most toxic situations. Part 3: Pain and Struggle as Part of God's Design. The idea that pain and struggle could be part of God's divine design might seem difficult to accept, especially when we are in the middle of a trial. We often ask ourselves, why is this happening to me, and why does it feel like I am being tested beyond my limits? But the Bible gives us a profound answer: struggle, pain, and hardship are often the very tools God uses to refine his chosen ones and to prepare them for greater purposes. In fact, the Bible makes it clear that suffering is not pointless. It is often part of the process that shapes us into the people God has called us to be. Consider the story of Joseph once again. His journey was filled with betrayal, abandonment, and hardship. After being sold into slavery by his brothers, Joseph found himself in a foreign land, far from everything he knew. He faced temptation, false accusations, and imprisonment. It would have been easy for him to give up, to curse his circumstances, or to lose faith in God's plan. But Joseph remained faithful to God, and in the process, he grew stronger. His character was refined in the furnace of suffering, and through his trials, he learned to trust in God's timing and provision. In Romans 5 verses 3-4, the Apostle Paul writes, "Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope." This verse speaks directly to the process that God uses to shape his chosen ones. Perseverance and character don't come through ease and comfort, they come through trials and hardships. When we face challenges, it's easy to focus on the pain, but it's important to remember that these difficulties are often where God is doing his deepest work in our lives. Through our struggles, God builds in us a character that will be useful for his purposes. James 1 verses 2-4 also tells us, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." God's design is to mature us, and maturity often comes through the hard lessons that suffering teaches us. The process of refining is not easy, but it is necessary for the work God has prepared for us. Without these struggles, we would not develop the resilience, wisdom, or strength needed to fulfill our divine calling. As you reflect on your own life and the pain you've experienced, remember that God does not waste suffering. The pain you face is not random or meaningless. It is part of God's plan to prepare you for something greater. The difficulties you experience in your family, whether they come from rejection, betrayal, or misunderstanding, are the very tools God uses to strengthen you, to refine your character, and to make you more like Christ. As hard as it is to see in the moment, God is working through your pain to bring about His purpose for your life. Part 4: Overcoming the Toxicity and Fulfilling God's Purpose. While it is clear that God uses pain and struggle to refine us, it's also true that we are called to rise above the toxicity around us in order to fulfill God's purpose. The chosen ones, those whom God has called for His greater plan, are not meant to remain victims of their circumstances. Instead, they are called to overcome the toxicity and dysfunction in their families and to walk in the purpose God has set before them. Overcoming the toxicity in a family dynamic is not an easy task. It requires strength, wisdom, and, above all, faith. The Bible shows us that even when we are surrounded by dysfunction, God empowers us to rise above it. The key is to trust in God's greater plan and to focus on His calling, even when the voices around us are negative or discouraging. Think about Moses' life. He was born into an oppressed family, and although he was raised as a prince in Pharaoh's palace, he never escaped the reality of being a Hebrew. His sense of identity was shaped by the injustice his people faced. When Moses saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Israelites, he responded impulsively and killed the Egyptian. He fled for his life, thinking that his past mistakes had ruined any chance he had of fulfilling his calling. But God did not abandon Moses. Instead, He called him from a burning bush, reminding him that his life had a divine purpose despite the pain and mistakes of his past. God called Moses to lead the Israelites out of slavery, and through his strength, Moses was able to overcome the oppressive systems around him. Similarly, Joseph's journey wasn't just about surviving the toxicity of his family, it was about thriving in the midst of it. Joseph could have easily succumbed to bitterness and resentment. He had every reason to give up on God and to live in anger. But he chose to trust in God's plan, even when things seemed unfair and impossible. As a result, Joseph rose to prominence in Egypt, where he was in a position to save not only his family but also an entire nation from famine. David's story also illustrates how overcoming toxicity and fulfilling God's purpose often go hand in hand. Despite being rejected by his family, overlooked by his father, and betrayed by his own children, David rose to become the king of Israel. He was not immune to pain, but he remained faithful to God and fulfilled the purpose God had for him. He trusted that God's plan was greater than his own understanding of his circumstances. The chosen ones are called to stand firm in their faith, even when their families are filled with dysfunction, rejection, and betrayal. This is not a call to ignore or minimize the pain of toxic family dynamics. Instead, it's a call to rise above them and to focus on the higher purpose God has for your life. Overcoming the toxicity around you requires the strength that only God can provide. It requires obedience to His voice, even when it's difficult to hear over the noise of familial conflict. If you are facing toxicity in your own family, remember that you are not alone. God has a greater purpose for your life, and He is equipping you to rise above the struggles you face. He is using those challenges to prepare you for something greater, just as He did with Joseph, Moses, and David. Don't let the toxicity of your family define you. Instead, let it refine you. Trust in God's calling for your life, and know that He is faithful to bring His plans to fruition, no matter the circumstances. Keep your eyes on Him, and walk boldly into the future He has prepared for you. Part 5: Transformation and Redemption of Toxic Families. One of the most profound aspects of the chosen ones in the Bible is that they are not only called to overcome their family's dysfunction, but also to be agents of transformation and redemption within those very families. The impact of a chosen one is not confined to their personal success or fulfillment of their divine purpose. Often, the journey of the chosen one includes the responsibility of healing, restoring, and reconciling broken relationships within their families. It's in this space of transformation that we see the greatest evidence of God's redemptive power at work. Take the example of Joseph once more. After years of suffering, betrayal, and separation from his family, he was finally reunited with his brothers during a time of famine. Instead of seeking revenge or holding grudges, Joseph chose forgiveness. He understood that what his brothers meant for evil, God meant for good, Genesis 50 verse 20. Through his forgiveness, Joseph not only saved his own family from famine but also restored them, healing the divisions that had plagued them for years. This act of forgiveness and redemption is a powerful picture of how God can use the chosen ones to bring healing to even the most broken families. The process of redemption often involves the hardest choices: forgiving those who have hurt you, letting go of past offenses, and being willing to reconcile, even when it seems impossible. But it is through these acts of grace that God brings healing not just to the chosen one, but to their families as well. Moses, too, was called to bring not just physical freedom to the Israelites but spiritual renewal. His leadership was about more than just delivering them from slavery, it was about leading them into a new covenant relationship with God. God chose Moses to bring redemption to a people who had long been oppressed, and through Moses, God re-established His promises with His people. This transformation was not immediate. The journey was long and filled with challenges, but Moses' obedience to God's calling ultimately led to the redemption of a nation. Similarly, David's life is a picture of how God uses the chosen ones to break the cycle of dysfunction and sin. Despite his own failures, David's reign marked the beginning of a new chapter for Israel. His heart for God and his desire to see God's will fulfilled brought about a spiritual renewal in Israel. He understood that his role as king was not just to lead, but to be a conduit of God's restoration for the people of Israel. In his Psalms, David expressed deep repentance, humility, and a longing for God's presence, showing that redemption begins with a heart fully surrendered to God. The chosen ones, in the midst of their own struggles and pain, are called to be the vessels through which God's redemptive power flows. Just as Joseph forgave his brothers, Moses led the Israelites to freedom, and David sought to bring spiritual renewal to his nation, the chosen ones today are called to do the same in their families. The process of redemption can be messy and difficult, but it is also deeply rewarding. By walking in God's forgiveness and grace, the chosen ones have the opportunity to break generational curses, restore broken relationships, and lead their families into a place of healing and peace. This process of transformation is not just about changing the external circumstances but also about changing the hearts of those involved. The chosen ones have the unique privilege and responsibility of being instruments of God's healing in their families, allowing His love, forgiveness, and grace to flow through them. As you reflect on the ways you can bring healing to your own family, remember that God has equipped you to be a vessel of transformation, no matter how difficult the journey may seem. Conclusion: embracing God's greater plan in your life. As we come to the close of this exploration, one truth stands clear: being born into a toxic family is not the end of the story. It may feel like it at times, but it is merely the beginning of a greater narrative that God is weaving for your life. The chosen ones in the Bible, despite being born into broken, dysfunctional environments, were never abandoned by God. Instead, God used their struggles and challenges to refine them, prepare them, and ultimately fulfill His divine purpose for them. And the same is true for you. No matter how toxic your family dynamics may be, remember that God has a plan for your life. He chose you for a purpose, and that purpose is not limited by the circumstances of your birth or your family situation. In fact, God often works in and through brokenness to bring about His greatest miracles. The pain you've experienced, the struggles you've faced, and the dysfunction you've had to endure can all be used for His glory. The Bible is full of examples of God's redemptive power. He took the stories of people like Joseph, Moses, and David, people who experienced rejection, betrayal, and hardship, and turned their pain into something beautiful. He used their suffering to shape them into leaders who would change the world. And He can do the same with you. Your struggles, no matter how difficult, are not wasted. They are part of God's plan to prepare you for something greater. Through the trials you face, God is building your character, strengthening your faith, and equipping you to fulfill the calling He has placed on your life. The key is to remain faithful, to trust in His timing, and to keep your eyes on His purpose for you. If you find yourself in a toxic family situation, take heart. God is not finished with you yet. He is using this season to prepare you for something amazing. You are not defined by your circumstances, you are defined by God's call on your life. Embrace the journey, trust in His process, and know that He is with you every step of the way. As you move forward, remember that you are not alone. God has a plan to redeem and restore not just your life, but your family as well. Through His grace and love, you can be an instrument of transformation, bringing healing to those around you. And as you fulfill your calling, you will find that the very struggles that once seemed insurmountable will become the platform from which you launch into the destiny God has prepared for you. So take courage, trust God, and know that your story is still being written. The best is yet to come.